Think about the last time you canceled plans. Not because anything was wrong, but because the thought of spending hours around people suddenly felt exhausting. You closed the door, sat in the quiet, and felt relief. Most people call that introversion, but psychologists have found that people who genuinely enjoy being alone don't all arrive there the same way. Some were born with nervous systems that noticed more. Some grew up in homes where solitude was the only place they could truly rest. And some discovered very early that their own imagination was more engaging than the room around them. Let's start with the memory almost everyone has some version of. Think back far enough, and there's probably a version of you sitting alone on a bedroom floor, deep inside a world nobody else could see. Maybe it was army men fighting a war only you understood the politics of. Maybe it was a shoebox of stuffed animals with names, jobs, and quiet rivalries. A whole civilization built out of bottle caps and secondhand action figures, run by a kid who wasn't bored or lonely, just completely absorbed, mildly annoyed whenever dinner interrupted the plot. Jerome Singer, a psychologist who spent decades at Yale studying how children play, found that kids who lose themselves in this kind of solo make-believe tend to develop richer language and sharper focus, along with a lot of early practice handling big feelings somewhere nothing is actually at stake. Pretend play, it turns out, works like rehearsal with no audience. You get to try out being brave, being in charge, being someone else completely with zero real-world risk attached. For a certain kind of kid, the world in their own head simply had more range than the one in the room around them, which made their own company the most interesting company on offer. Take a different kind of kid in a totally ordinary room, a birthday party, say, or a packed classroom. Everyone else seems fine, but this kid can hear the hum of the fridge, the scrape of 40 chairs, someone's perfume 2 seats over, all of it arriving at once, like the volume on the whole world got turned up for them and nobody else. By the time the piñata comes out, they aren't having less fun than everyone, they're just more tired. The psychologist Elaine Aron spent years researching this exact difference and named it sensory processing sensitivity, a nervous system that takes in more information and takes it in more deeply than most people's does. Her research suggests it shows up in around 1 in every 5 or 6 people. It isn't shyness, and it isn't a flaw in the wiring. It's more sensitivity running in both directions, to a slammed door, but also to a friend's tone shifting mid-sentence, to the exact color of a sunset nobody else stopped to look at. For a highly sensitive kid, a quiet bedroom was never really a retreat from the world. It was the volume turned back down to a level they could actually think in. Here's the part that surprised even the researchers studying this. It doesn't start at the birthday party. It starts before a baby can even hold up its own head. In the late 1980s, a Harvard psychologist named Jerome Kagan started showing 4-month-olds things they'd never seen before: a popped balloon, an unfamiliar voice, a mobile swinging into view. Most of the babies just watched, curious, but about 1 in 5 did something else entirely. Arms flailing, backs arching, crying immediately, like a 5-alarm signal had gone off over a bath toy. Kagan called them high-reactive, and he didn't stop watching after that one afternoon. He followed the same children for years, into adolescence and then into adulthood, and the high-reactive babies grew up far more likely to become the cautious ones, the watchful ones, the kids who'd rather study a new group for a while before joining in. Not fearful exactly, just wired before they had words for anything to notice more and need more time to process what they'd noticed. Which means for some of you, this didn't start with an event. There was no single bad birthday, no one moment you can point to and blame. Some of this was already true about you in the hospital blanket. But not every version of this story starts in the nervous system. Some of them start in the house itself. Meet the other kind of kid, 9, maybe 10, who can read a room before she's said a single word in it. She knows from the sound of the front door whether tonight's an easy night or a night she needs to get her little brother upstairs early and keep the television loud enough to cover the voices downstairs. Nobody assigned her this job. She just noticed one day that somebody had to do it, and she was the one paying attention. Psychologists have a name for what happens to kids like her: parentification, a term for when a child ends up carrying adult-sized responsibility for the emotional weather of an entire household. Georgia State University psychologist Gregory Jurikovic, who has researched this for most of his career, has documented it across every kind of family, not only the ones with an obvious crisis going on, which is part of why it so often gets missed entirely. For a kid like that, time alone in her room was never withdrawal. It was the only 10 minutes of the day nobody needed anything from her. As an adult, a room with the door shut can still feel like the one place in the world that isn't a job. Not all of these stories start with something going wrong, though. One of the biggest ones starts with almost the opposite. Picture a 2-year-old on the living room floor, stacking blocks, narrating some private plot only he understands. Across the room, his mother's in the armchair, reading, not playing with him, not narrating his every move, not even really watching. He glances up once, clocks that she's there, and goes right back to the blocks. He isn't really alone, he just doesn't need her doing anything. He only needs to know she's near. The psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott wrote about this exactly back in the 1950s in a short, well-known paper called The Capacity to Be Alone. His idea was a bit of a paradox. He argued that a person's ability to genuinely enjoy solitude later in life gets built, oddly enough, out of moments like this one, being alone in the presence of somebody. A caregiver who's near but not hovering, present but not performing, teaches a kid something most people never consciously learn: that being alone doesn't mean being unsafe or unwanted or forgotten. It just means being alone. Which means for some of you, loving your own company was never a wound that needs explaining. It was something you were quietly given. This is the one that pulls everything else together. A 15-year-old is alone in her room with a violin, playing the same 8 bars for the 11th time, getting it wrong, starting over. In the 1980s, the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and his team at the University of Chicago gave real teenagers like her actual pagers, the buzzing kind you'd clip to a waistband, set to go off at random points, day and night. Every time it buzzed, the teenager had to stop and write down exactly what they were doing and how it felt then, no editing. What the researchers found was that the teenagers who could tolerate being alone with a hard, unglamorous task, no audience, nobody clapping, just them and the 11th repetition, were the ones whose skill kept developing over the years that followed. The ones who couldn't sit with that kind of solitude tended to drift from their own talent over time, not from a lack of ability, because they'd never gotten comfortable enough in their own company to put in the unglamorous hours that mastery actually requires. So that room you used to love shutting the door to, it was never just hiding. For a lot of people, it was the exact place their best skill was quietly being built. So if pieces of any of this were your childhood, here's what to actually do with it. That sensitivity that used to overwhelm you at parties is the same wiring that lets you notice what everyone else misses. Start using it on purpose instead of apologizing for it. The alone time you still crave isn't laziness, it's maintenance. Put it on the calendar like anything else that matters. If quiet focus is where you do your best work, stop treating a closed door like something you owe someone an explanation for. And loving your own company was never a backup plan for not having enough friends. It's one of the harder skills most adults never actually learn. You didn't end up like this by accident. You ended up like this for a reason, and it's a good one. So, if one of these felt a little too accurate, tell me which one in the comments. And if you want more of your own psychology explained like this, hit subscribe. See you in the next one.